Mark Sirkin, welcome to the Pulling Focus podcast. I'm really excited for today's conversation, and this one will be a little bit different from some other episodes we've had. We will jump into your background and what you're doing right now, but today's podcast is actually going to be a conversation about artificial intelligence and particularly creativity, which is something that both of us are passionate about. You know 100 times more than I do about AI. Which will be a just great starting point for the conversation. And I know we were discussing before this, just what should we talk about? And when we kind of leaned into the AI path, we just started going. And I was like, we got to save some of this for the podcast, which the day is finally here. So excited to continue that conversation.
Yeah.
But let's start with just a quick intro, who you are, what you do, and then we'll get into it.
Great. Thanks. First of all, thanks for having me. Hopefully we didn't blow all the good stuff on the pre conversation, but yeah. So, been in Raleigh for 5 years or so now. Moved down after my kids graduated high school. We lived in Connecticut. I've lived all over. Spent about 10 years in nonprofit fundraising, digital marketing fundraising. But I've spent time at companies like Microsoft, PwC, doing consulting, technology work. Basically, I'm a marketer. At this point, I'm a senior level marketer. I'm in a leadership position at a company that is a media publisher. So we publish digital magazines for marketers, and we run events for marketers, and we sell leads for marketers. So we're very focused on the marketing universe. And in that universe, obviously, AI is playing an increasingly important role, both as part of the technology platforms that we all use and love, but also as marketers who are executing marketing strategies and tactics. So my interest is both personal, like I'm super interested by what's happening with all these tools, but also professionally, there are real impacts to the publishing business in terms of how we think about, the benefits and the potential downsides of AI in the marketplace.
Yeah, and I think for those that may not be as familiar with AI, and when people use AI and artificial intelligence in the context of a conversation, it's a very broad thing.
Yeah.
So in your eyes, what are some of the main players in the space of AI? I think people have probably heard of like ChatGPT, but apart from that, what are some of the other kind of tools that you're mentioning that have really blown up in the past couple months even?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an AI expert in terms of like, I don't work at an AI company. I'm not a machine learning expert. I'm super interested bystander, prosumer, I guess, maybe you call it. And so when we talk about AI, I guess we should talk about, very broadly speaking, and again, not from an academic standpoint, but like what we're talking about mostly today is generative AI. So those are tools like ChatGPT that come from companies like OpenAI or Anthropic. Bing's AI is built on ChatGPT. ChatGPT itself is its own platform. So those generative tools, and we'll talk a lot more about what those tools are: image tools, audio tools, text, that kind of stuff. Those are somewhat general purpose AI tools. There are many, many specific AIs that have been built for all sorts of real specific purposes. Most recently, as I was thinking about this conversation, did you hear the story about the Beatles song that they're going to release?
I saw a news article that was like, it was like the last song.
Yeah. It was like on a cassette that like disappeared or something.
Yeah.
And so they found this super low fidelity cassette, and they used an AI to separate the audio from all the noise. So they basically have a clean recording from a 50-year-old cassette tape.
Wow.
That they're now going to release as basically a Beatles song.
Yeah.
So we're getting a new Beatles song this year, which is cool, thanks to AI.
Yeah.
Which is nuts, right? So that's a really specific use case of AI that's very different than, telling ChatGPT, write me a poem or something.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to sort of understand the breadth of these tools, and I'm, not going to sit here and explain all of them to you, but I think for today's purposes, we're mostly going to talk about generative AI tools that have prompts and outputs, inputs and outputs, and the machine does some kind of weird magic when you tell it something.
Yeah.
Broadly, and again, I'm being super vague and super general just so we can kind of get into it.
For sure.
But, the other side of it, and where you hear a lot of the, I don't want to say fear-mongering, but like the moral panic and like we should slow it down and what's going to happen if this thing becomes sentient or whatever these science fiction-y type stories are, which, by the way, we'll see if they're science fiction. I have no idea.
Sure.
But when you talk about sort of broad age, I think it's AGI, artificial general intelligence. The question is, are these things, do these things sort of transcend, and are they like a new species of some kind?
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's where the intersection of creativity becomes a really meaty, interesting conversation. That's where we That was the on-ramp to this
Right.
when we were talking, like, oh, what should we talk about?
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and just to establish kind of where I'm coming from in the conversation, I have like only scratched the surface, like barely used ChatGPT. I think I've asked it just like a few questions and have just messed around with it a little bit, but nothing substantial. And I'm also a little bit skeptical of the technology and what that means for creativity, being a musician on the side, and have seen what's happened with music, and just knowing the kind of ins and outs of the songwriting process specifically. I don't even feel like I want to ask ChatGPT to write a song for me, because like I feel like that's not like right. So yeah, let's dive in a little bit on the implications of creativity. I think a very broad question. I'm just curious to get your thoughts on what even is creativity. How do you even start to define that? Because maybe that helps understand if something like AI is creative.
It's such a broad question. Before I do that, I'm curious, because I have used these tools a lot. There's so many, but like, what was your reaction? Like, you type in a thing and whatever the prompt was, you get something back. Like, what was your emotional reaction to the machine spitting something back at you that you've asked it?
At first, I was like, so I probably used it a total of like 3 hours in total. At first, I was wowed that like it was essentially kind of having a conversation with me. And then the more I used it, the more it felt like it was just pulling from Google. And a lot of the answers were structured similarly. I even used it to help me write, write a blog article on video production and stuff like that. And every time I was told it to write a blog article, it was like structured in the exact same way. It was good content, but I was like, where is this coming from? Like, is this coming from another source?
Yeah.
And it is like almost indistinguishable, or is it like a unique new thing? And I kind of came to the conclusion, at least in my mind from how I used it, that it felt like a more advanced kind of search engine.
Yeah. So again, just as we kind of ease into this huge question, what is creativity? Let me talk super briefly about where the answer to that question, when you type in ChatGPT, where does it come from?
Mm-hmm.
So there's these things called large language models. You'll hear people talk about LLMs, and they're these massive, like, they just hoover up all the data that they can get their hands on, literally whatever piece of data they can get. And they get all this in a super oversimplifying, but they get all this stuff into a database, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is now it knows that the dog ran across the street as a sentence, because it like has an unfathomable amount of sentences in it, sentence structure, right? And so the way it works is, and it feels super counterintuitive until you really think about it. Like, when ChatGPT or any generative AI gives you an answer back, it's literally predicting the next word. Like, so if you write it looks in its entire database. It's not like a Google search. That's one of the things people have to sort of understand. It's not really searching Google. It's searching this massive language model that has got semantic connections and interconnections between human language.
Sure.
And so it starts determining, based on a whole bunch of other factors, what the next word in any given sentence is. That explains kind of how you'll get things that sound very, very familiar, because it's like, well, that's how you would say it.
Yeah.
You know, the rain in Spain. If
Yeah.
you type the rain, finish the sentence, the rain in, it's going to probably say Spain.
Yeah.
Which I haven't tried, but I probably should try that later.
Yeah.
But it should work. So you've got a large language model, which is a corpus of an enormous amount of text, like, I don't even know, I wouldn't even say a number, but lots and lots of text. And then you have a machine that is able to predict the next word. Now, there's a thing called temperature inside ChatGPT, basically inside this chatbot, and you can tell it, like, hey, I want it to be. If you've used Bing, you'll see this. If anybody out there has used Bing, it'll say more precise, more creative, or more balanced. I think those are the three. Those are temperature settings, quote unquote temperature.
Sure.
Meaning a very high. If I get this wrong, I'm going to be embarrassed. But a very high temperature means be very precise. A very low temperature means do whatever you want. So you can get wildly different things if you just tell it, hey, change the temperature. The default is kind of in the middle. So you can sort of get what you expect.
That just makes me think of, real quick, like Interstellar,
Yeah.
when Matthew McConaughey tells the robot to like turn the sarcasm
Yeah,
to like
turn the
20%
target.
or
That's
whatever.
exactly that.
Yeah.
And so as we slowly march to the answer to the question, I think there's some really interesting parallels. Right before we started, I was talking about this book, Diamond Age, which is this Neil Stephenson book. It's a great book. It's from, I think, the 80s. And it kind of foretells something like ChatGPT, like a lot of good science fiction does. And I think that modern computer scientists and scientists are science fiction fans. And we see this playing out all the time, right? Like it used to be like, oh, I can't wait to have the Star Trek communicator in my pocket. Well, that was the Motorola Razr.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that was it. Like they built it. They're like, we're going to build it. That's really cool. And so this happens all the time. That's sort of one piece. The other piece that I think is interesting, and I'm way over my ski tips in sort of try to explain this. So I won't try to explain. I'll just observe it, which is these tools are built like they're built on neural networks. So they're biological in thought. In structure. They're not actually biological, they're machines, but they're built to simulate something biological. Okay, so to me, I'm like, okay, so we're simulating human thought. We're trying to simulate human thought. We may not be very good at it, but we're better than we were a while ago and maybe 2 weeks ago or maybe 6 months ago or maybe 6 years ago. And so the question of creativity is really complicated in a world where you have a machine that can appear to be creative. And by the way, I would say I'm definitely pro technology, but I'm, like a lot of people, a little bit cautious about what's happening with these technologies. Like it seems like a lot and it feels like it's happened very quickly. Like where was this a year ago? Like we weren't, the broad society wasn't talking about AI a year ago. And now it's all we can talk about. And so where did it all come from? Well, they've been working on it a long time. AI is not new. They were talking about AI I think in the 30s and 40s in terms of machine learning. And so, creativity is one of these things, like it's such a great word. It has a lot of emotional impact to me. My dream in college was I was going to be a creative director at a big ad agency. Until I worked at an ad agency. I was like, I don't want to work in an ad agency. No offense to ad agencies. But that was my construction of creativity. You're a musician, so you have a slightly different version. So we all define creativity in different ways. And so as we go through the conversation, it's like there's one other piece, which is like the commercialization of creativity is tricky because, I'm like half prepared, right? Like I think it was, I want to say definitely Picasso didn't really sell very many until he died. Okay, well, he had no commercial value until he was passed, so he got to enjoy none of it. His family benefited, but he benefited none, and yet arguably one of the most creative humans ever live. So I think there's a separation too that we have to be careful about as we navigate through, because a lot of the current examples are things like slow down AI or the WGA strike, or today the Grammys announced you can't win an award, you can't win a Grammy if your music is AI generated. So we're going to see the legal side and the commercialization side of this dominate the headlines, but I don't think that impacts our individual ability to look at a piece of technology and say, how can I use this to help me in whatever creativity, whatever act I'm doing? If I'm, if I do crochets, can I ask it to create a new pattern? Sure. Like if I'm a writer, can I ask it to help me think about plot lines or develop characters or, whatever you might want to do. So I think there's a separation there as well. And, my interests lie in just pure creativity. Like how do we use these tools to just help ourselves scratch whatever that itch is? I know you have it. I have it. Like I'm trying to write a screenplay right now and I'm like, I can't get going. So, well, let me ask. Like I'm trying to write a story about this, and this. What would be something unexpected that might happen to this character? Oh, here's 12 things. I don't like any of those, but one of them, there's a germ of an idea. So I think, where I end up on some of this is like these tools are maybe unparalleled and unprecedented helpers, but they're basically helpers at this point that we can leverage. And so I can't answer, it's a long way around. Like I can't answer the question, what is creativity? But I think it's some weird melding of, different ideas coming together to create something maybe not totally new, but, a shade of perspective, a new viewpoint that is infused with your own, as the artist, your own version of whatever that is. And so it's a great question. I don't know, what do you think? What do you think creativity is?
I think like aspects of creativity from, at least from a music perspective, and this even applies to some of the work we do here with like filmmaking, is there's like this inherent struggle of like your talent and your time and your like abilities, which is like your talents like refined through practice, and just the ability to combine a lot of things to come up with some kind of end product. And like in my mind, like anyone can learn how to play guitar. Like if you Yeah, anyone can learn how to play guitar. It's just a matter of like time and willingness and like your understanding to do that. But some people choose not to, right? And so then there's this sort of like then hierarchy of people who put in more time and people who have talent. Like, you know, Stevie Ray Vaughan has more talent than a guy who's been also playing, you know, or had more talent. So yeah, I think it's a complicated thing, because I think about somebody using AI in a music sense to generate like the perfect guitar track and claim it as, you know, an actual person playing. But that just completely removes like the 50 years that it would take to get to that point to play that.
To be able to produce that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't have mixed feelings over the sentiment, but I have mixed feelings around the role of modern technology as a lever.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I grew up in an age where desktop publishing was going to change everything. Like desktop
Mm-hmm.
publishing was the thing when I was like in college. And like the first Macs came out. It's like, oh my God, you could lay this out exactly the way, like it was a big deal. And all the designers, I was one of them. I went to art school. I was a designer. All the designers were like, oh, we won't have jobs. Because like grandma can do her newsletter now.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
you know, it turns out you're not getting paid for grandma's newsletter. Like grandma's pickleball club newsletter doesn't need a professional designer.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of a protected class, because the level of, I don't know, creativity, fidelity, expertise, 10,000 hours, all the stuff that makes you able to produce a film the way you guys do, or a piece of art, the way Picasso does, whatever it might be, like that all counts. But like if Picasso lived before, I don't know, paintbrushes, around, like I don't, you know, I'm being ridiculous on purpose, but like, you know, I think at some level that's what these things are. They're tools, and so how we apply tools and how we regulate tools and how we govern the use of tools. Just because you have, you know, a 3D printer doesn't mean you're allowed to print a 3D gun and go shoot somebody.
Sure.
So there's rules.
Yeah.
I think the problem with AI right now is that we are as humans, we're coming to grips with like, what can this do? Like, wait, it can what?
Yeah.
It can write a song.
Yeah.
Oh, is the song any good? Can I sell it? Like, do I get credit for it?
Yeah.
What's the copyright? Like, there's a million questions that come with it. So we don't even understand how it works, let alone what the implications of it are. And we're already talking about what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is because it crashed on us. Like it felt overnight. Now, I have been interested in AI for a couple of years, like seriously interested. And so I had been using GPT Playground for like 6 months or so before ChatGPT came out. That thing had been available for like a year. It was not as easy to use.
Yeah.
But it was all there. Like you could build your own ChatGPT like a year before ChatGPT actually became a thing. But nobody did.
Sure.
So these guys release this thing, and all of a sudden the world turns upside down. Microsoft's racing around trying to beat, you know, and so the lever of the tool, I think, in the annals of creativity is worth thinking about, right? Like what set us on this path actually was this, I think I said something ridiculous like, well, the monks in the 1400s, like when they had to save books, you know, as the Dark Ages were coming on, like, well, if they just had a printing press,
exactly,
wouldn't have had that problem.
Yeah.
Well, meanwhile, they got hundreds of monks who are like furiously copying books and like shoveling them off. There's a great book about this, by the way, about like how the monks saved books or something.
Yeah.
It's probably not the title, but it's something like that. And they like shuffled them, they copied them down and shuffled them away to like a place where they thought the Dark Ages wouldn't get to the books.
Sure.
So here comes a printing press, and now you've got democratization of printing, which changed the world, right? That was one of the big, giant shifts in human society, as is the internet in sort of current day talk. And so, you know, what's that got to do with creativity? Kind of everything, right? Like everything. Like you have tools that you just couldn't even fathom. They feel like magic at some level. Like, forget Photoshop's new generative tool where you can take, a friend of mine did this. He's like, check this out. He and his wife had a picture from their wedding, and it was sort of a horizontal photo, right? Full body photo of them kind of overlooking crashing waves behind them. And he took that photo and he made it 16 by 9 and filled in the background, and it's seamless. You can't tell. I zoomed up, like you can't tell. How did it do that? Where'd the wave come from that's in the photo that wasn't there before? I mean, it was there when they took the photo, but the camera didn't capture it, so it's gone, right? Yeah. Well, no, the computer just rebuilt it, and we can look at it. And so that's unprecedented. Like 6 months ago, that was literally not possible. And now it is suddenly possible. And so you put these tools in the hands of artists and they do incredible things with it. I think that ultimately AI is going to be an absolute boon for creativity, broadly speaking. What is the impact for AI on things like copyright is another story. But that's a human legislated thing, right? Like when the WGA strike ends or doesn't end, whatever's going to happen there, we're going to know what's going on. I mean, today the studios literally have left off AI as a negotiating point. They're like, we're not discussing it.
Yeah. Because
the only thing you can think of is, the Joe Russo quote saying like, oh, AI is going to be able to make movies in 2 years. And this is a guy who made like most of the Marvel movies. Like, guy makes great films. What's he think of this? My guess is that he thinks it's a new lever as a creator that I can pull on.
Yeah.
But, does that mean there won't be carnage? I don't know. There's so many examples. The Drake thing where somebody took and sampled Drake's voice, put it up on YouTube.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you got Grimes who has Grimes AI on Spotify. Like, you go listen to music and she's sharing proceeds with her fan community. Like, it's amazing. And then the Ed Sheeran lawsuit that just wrapped up. I mean, Ed basically oversimplifying, not a legal person. I watched the YouTube summary.
Yeah.
But Ed basically is claiming like there's chords that exist. They just exist. No one owns them. And we all musicians create music off those same chords. We're all working with the same canvas.
Yeah.
So how can you tell me I can't write that song? Yeah, of course it sounds like the other song.
Yeah.
It used the same chords. And the story is kind of really interesting because in his concerts, and interestingly enough, I just saw him in Atlanta a few weeks ago. He didn't do any medleys, but apparently in the past he's done medleys of other songs. Yeah. And some of the medleys are songs that were in the lawsuit. Like this Marvin Gaye song, like, oh, it sounds just like it. He's like, yeah, it's the same chord progression. Yeah. Like, that's what it is. Yes. But like, you can't legislate that.
Sure.
And so we go all the way back to the beginning of the conversation. What's a large language model? It's a corpus of all of human, whatever they could suck up.
Sure.
Human knowledge, human art. Midjourney is the image generator. What is it made up of? It's made up of a massive large language model of a whole bunch of different images. Like, all the cats you've ever imagined, all the dogs you imagined, all the Lord of the Rings art that you've ever imagined, right? So you can say, like, give me Gandalf as a cat, and it does it. Well, how does it do that? Well, it knows what Gandalf looks like, and it knows what a cat looks like, and it's an image tool. So it can do that. It can do that 10 times, 1 million times, 100 million times faster than a human can do it. But does that mean it's creative? The notion of making Gandalf into a cat is kind of creative. That's a fun idea. Okay.
And you came up with it.
And I came up with it. So I just did a creative act by saying, oh, is the machine's act of doing it creative? I don't know. Like, I don't know. Did the machine do something creative there, or did the machine not do something creative? And it just did a thing. Like, it's just software doing software things. I don't know. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm trying very hard not to apply. Like, it's not a human. It's not a species. It's a machine. It's a predictive model. Is what it is. Yeah. And when you look at it as a predictive model, it's hard to have a conversation and think like it's creative. No, the human's the creative part in the equation, I think. But the human has now a lever that is 1 million times longer than any lever we've ever had. Like,
I guess it's not a bad thing to, if you look at history and what tools have enabled people to do. Like, you think about cave paintings versus someone using Photoshop.
Right.
That's a huge gap.
It's a huge gap.
But I guess the question then becomes the effort. The effort is just decreased, but like the ideas are still kind of the same. And, the tools enable you to do things easier.
Is easier the right word? Like, this is like, I think it's really, the line of thought that you're going down is really interesting because you're almost, I don't know if you mean to, I don't know if I'm interpreting it, like you're almost headed towards the tortured artist. Like, it was painful to become an artist. It was painful. I didn't have food for years and I busked for years and finally I got my big break. Yeah. And like, is all that creativity, or is that just perseverance and determination, and the creativity is actually the art part? Like, I have no idea. Like, I honestly, I don't.
Well, then it becomes a question of expression because like if you're making a song and it's a personal thing, then like the struggle and difficulty to like get those feelings onto paper into like metric verse and rhyming, like that is, I mean, it's not that enjoyable to me at least, but it at least feels there's something therapeutic about the effort going in and then it having that connection to you. If it's like I want to make Gandalf as a cat, like I don't really want to spend a bunch of time trying to Photoshop them together.
Right.
I'd rather just have
a machine do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where do you get your most creative satisfaction from? Like, what's the thing that you do that you're like, that really was a satisfying creative experience?
I think it's like with music, it's like the ideas and it's the puzzle pieces with the sounds all coming together. So like, it's not necessarily the chords. Like chords are, chords. There's only so many notes you can choose from, but it's like how the instruments work together and, I tweak this reverb sound and it makes it completely different and stuff like that.
So, okay. So let's play this all the way out to the end, all the way to the end. So you've got a machine, not like one we have today, but a much better one, one that can literally simulate and predict every variation of that song that you started. Like I want to write a love song, and it goes, okay, great. Here's a bajillion. Let's start to winnow them down. And you start going, I want one like a little less reverb, a little more this, a little more sappy, a little more 80s feel. Like you just give it all the things. You're just prompting it. And it finally goes, here's your song. Boop. It's like, like magic. And you're like, oh, I actually really like that. That feels creative to me. It feels like you're using a really advanced tool to do the same thing you're doing today. You're just doing it a different way. I mean, I don't know. I'm wondering.
It feels like it would be exciting. The one piece that's missing is the skill of playing the instrument. Yeah. And like, I know that I can't play guitar like John Mayer can, but it's still like trying my best and like feeling good about like learning something new. Yeah. But there is a piece that I'm thinking about, especially for just being one person. Like I don't work with like a lot of people or really anybody. There is that piece of like, there's so many steps just to get to a song that gets out on like Spotify or Apple Music, like all of the mixing and the writing and the producing and the arrangement and all of that stuff that like I could see there being a reality in which like AI tools could help people. But then it also makes me think like, does that devalue the other music that is on Spotify or, would it saturate the market a little bit?
Well, the saturation's coming if it's not already here. Like, like the ability to mass produce millions of variations of cat Gandalfs is easy, right? We could do that today. You and I could sit down in 10 minutes. We'll have more. There'll be so many cat images, we won't even get through them in our lifetimes. Like that's how many images there'll be. So it's not a matter of volume or quantity. I think what you're getting at is more the quality question. And I think, it's funny. I was talking to somebody, a filmmaker, and we were in this part of the conversation, and he kind of reflected back on the monks. He's like, well, like the value of the monk, that like if you had that book today, it would be enormously valuable, both monetarily, but also just, like, oh my God, that's the 1400s version of the whatever, and there it is, that like a monk from 1400 wrote that. I mean, I don't know how you feel, but I know that like I had a friend who collected coins and he handed me like an original like coin from like the Roman Empire. And I was like, I don't know, like it was weird holding it. I was like, there's something, and like if you go, like for me, I go to Washington D.C., I get a very overwhelming weird feel. Like I don't know what the feeling is. Like, it's hard to describe. It's like history is here. We went up to Stagville 3 weeks ago, and same thing. I had that overwhelming feeling of like, okay, I'm in a place. There's a thing happening here. Yeah. And in the computer, it's like you don't. I'm trying to think now in real time. Like, have I ever had that feeling of place in a virtual place? I don't know that I have. I got to think about that. But the what you're getting at and what I'm talking about here is like there's different ways to look at creativity and there's different ways to value it. Yeah. For me personally, in my hobby or whatever, like I'm a writer. So I have written a couple of screenplays and I'm working on a radio, like a podcast, like a fiction type of deal right now. And I'm under no delusions that anything will happen with it. I'll probably never get it produced. My friends will read it and tell me how great it is, but it's terrible. Like it's all that, right? Yeah. But that doesn't diminish not 1 inch of the creative expression I get from doing it in the first place. So I'm sitting there 2 o'clock in the morning writing my script. I'm like, oh, I'll have this happen. I'll have this guy do this crazy thing. I asked ChatGPT for 5 crazy examples or like rip off half of a Succession like dialogue because like, oh, I really like that. Yeah. And so like there's a bunch of different avenues I'm kind of all over the place, but like I think that act of creativity is just so interesting to me.
Yeah.
And with new tools comes new ways of being creative. And again, we can look in history and find so many of them. It seems like every day there's a new tool today to help you write or paint or draw or whatever.
Right.
And I almost feel like ultimately it is a good thing. It's just a confusing thing because the tools have never been this powerful. Like I think that's one of the things that I'm like starting to realize is like, oh, like humans struggle with infinite possibilities. Like it's hard. And there's actually been books written. I think the book is called Less. There's a book called Less. There's a bunch of books about, how humans make decisions.
Yeah, and like the paradox of choice.
Yeah, exactly. Like we get completely overwhelmed by that. Like you don't even know it's happening. You're just like, I'm just overwhelmed. I'll just choose that one because at least I've made a choice.
Yeah.
And now you're looking at like, well, there's infinite number of ways to express my creativity with infinite number of tools. Like, holy crap, what do you do next? Like, I honestly like, it's hard. Like I get distracted. It's like a shiny, it's like, like I played with Midjourney for 3 weeks. Like I didn't do anything. I wrote not a single word of my screenplay because I just was like creating ridiculous images and trying to figure out like, oh, if I say this way, it does that. So I think, I think that's creativity. Like learning how to use a new tool is creativity unto itself. And so it's an interesting thing. The other side of this, which I think is really interesting, and I haven't really spent enough time thinking about it, but you know how like, when you're a kid and you're learning to do something, you copy the thing you like.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like I know when I learned how to draw, I was obsessed with knights and, armor and all this stuff. And I had this crazy book that was like, I don't even know what the book was about, but the cover was like a medieval looking knight with a shield and a sword. He was standing like this, whatever. And I must have drawn that knight 1,000 times. Like, in high school when you're like, not paying attention, you're drawing on your, but that was what I was drawing. And people are like, what's with the knight? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I think the act of getting the 10,000 hours, getting the skill, part of it, certainly in the early days, is copying. I mean, I know that like you read a book about music or you read a book about screenwriting. It's like, well, here's the structure, Save the Cat or story engineering or whatever it might be. And so you're like, okay, great. Well, let me study how stories are done. Here's Star Wars, hero's journey. Here's what happens to Luke. Well, I saw this really incredible thing on it was Twitter the other day where someone had taken the basic plot points of Star Wars and crossed out Luke's name and just written in Harry. Sure. And I'm like, oh, it still works. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, I mean, the hero's journey is like through all
It's like plug and play.
Yeah.
So like chords, you're talking about fundamental DNA building blocks that you build creative acts on top of.
Yeah.
And you start by copying the things you love, right? You make a fan fiction movie about the Avengers because you love the Avengers, right? You make a song that sounds like John Mayer because you love John Mayer. And then you progress your own skill level, which gets, I think, to what you're saying is like, where does skill fit into this? We got to get it somewhere.
Yeah.
And then you've got this weird alchemy of skill, experience, knowledge. You know what you like, you know what your taste is, you're figuring it out.
Yeah.
And you create something that's maybe commercially viable, but for 99.999% of us who like to play the guitar or like to write things, there's no selling it. The value is not in the selling it. And this is the part that I struggle with, which is when I started writing a few years, I got wrapped up in, well, maybe I could sell it. Sure. I mean, maybe that's possible. The reality is it's not possible. I mean, sure, it could happen. Like I could win the lottery, but I'm not going to play because for me, it devalued it. It actually made me stop writing at one point where I was like, why am I not writing? I'm like, oh, because I got wrapped up in the business. Yeah. So I kind of want to try to figure out how to cut through that and like get back to like, what is the creative act that fills me up? And what are the tools that are now available in 2023 that didn't exist ever? Yeah. That give me the opportunity to explore my creativity and what I'm interested in. Like, for example, professionally, we got to thinking, what would happen if you could just talk to our website? So our websites are for marketers, as I mentioned. Sure. And like, well, let's just build a chatbot and let people talk to it, see what they ask it. Yeah. Which is a inherently creative concept, right? Like that's a weird concept. Well, we did it and it works. Like you can go to our website and you can ask it all sorts of questions and it's not perfect. It's kind of like talking to a low-paid employee who doesn't really know everything or like a bad librarian. Like, but it works. So, I think that the tools crashing into our own mindset of creativity just unleashes, I think we're going to see some incredible things. Like this thing with Grimes where she's like promising to share proceeds. Yeah. So make a song with Grimes using her music, remix it, slash it up, do whatever you want to it, add your own stuff, and we'll split the proceeds with you. That's a really unique, bizarrely cool, creative concept that she's done. I don't know Grimes. I don't listen to Grimes music. I don't know. I don't think Pink or John Mayer will ever do this, but that's okay. But yet it continues to push the boundaries. And so now, is it a creative act if I take a song of Grimes and mix it with this other thing and then give it back to her and she puts it in her song? Is that creative? Feels like it is.
I mean, and then the question is like, is it still, there's no way to measure it. Is it still hers if someone takes that version, chops it up, makes it different, someone takes that version?
Who knows?
To me, that's so,
yeah.
I guess like there's not really a way in my mind that you could really like measure. I'm sure someone way smarter than me is like trying to come up with this.
They got a formula.
Like, a way to like measure like to the nth degree, this is still this person's ownership. I mean, does ownership exist at all in the future of digital media? I mean, I could make like a weird, I mean, on the guitar thing, I could make like a weird new version of a guitar that has 12, I mean, there already is a 12 string, 13 strings, and like you play it upside down and all this kind of stuff. Like that's my creation. Like that's a new thing.
Yeah.
But I guess in the digital means, like, is there any digital ownership in the future?
I'm not a lawyer. I can't answer. I can't even pretend to answer that question. But I will go back to what we talked earlier. I think when it occurred to me that with the Ed Sheeran thing, when I was reading about that and his very eloquent explanation of how chords work and this is what it's all built on, I started thinking about everything. Like I was looking around my house, I was looking at all the books. I'm like, okay, so, I remember, I remember watching something somewhat recently where they were saying, and my reaction to it was like, oh, everything is built on everything. It was a music thing. I think it might have been the Beatles documentary. I can't remember exactly, but it was showing, I think it was a TikTok actually, if I'm honest. It was a guy who was showing the progression of like music and style and how each generation builds on the last generation, how the Beatles built on Elvis and how U2, like I was actually maybe this was it. I was reading Bono's book and he was saying like they built like U2 was built to be a punk band. It was built to be a live performing punk band. Now, modern listeners will not identify U2 as a punk band, but that's their roots. And they were built on the backs of like all of the great punk bands of that era. Yeah. And so is creativity like, are we just building on what came before us? And is that a bad thing? Like, I mean, I'm not cynical, but like, I think there's cynics out there who are like, every story's already been told. Every song has already been sung, right? Like, and I think it gets a little esoteric and a little out there, but like, okay, my expression, what I bring to a creative act is the thing only I can bring, each of us. So whether I'm building on somebody else, now legally, again, I'm not a lawyer, right? Do you have the right to do that? This is where I think Adobe, for example, released their Firefly app, which indemnifies you against copyright issues, which is because they own all the artwork and they're saying, we give it to you. You can do whatever you want with it versus like a Midjourney platform, which who knows what the lawsuits are going to say. Like people are going to end up getting sued. You can't copyright it. I think it was China ruled on this the other day. The United States hasn't ruled on it. There'll be a bunch of legal stuff. Yeah. But again, like as far as legality and commercialism, that's not really where I'm like interested. Like that'll all wash itself out. What I'm interested in is like the next generation of creators. Like they have an amazing tool set to do incredible things. I hope some of them, most of them will not, but I hope some of them will not fall into the trap of just generating a bunch of junk. Yeah. As opposed to like actually being creative, which I think we're going to be astounded and blown away by what real artists and real creators can do with these kinds of levers in their hand. It's going to be unbelievable. Like it's really going to be amazing. So I'm like super excited for it. But I'm trying to cut through all the stuff, all the like, we should slow it down and there's a moral panic and is it good for society or the machine's going to come for us? Like, I don't know. Like I'm a huge, I just finished watching the latest season of Black Mirror. Like, sure, I get myself riled up, like everybody else can. But from a purely creative standpoint, wow, like if you're a creator and you're not experimenting with these tools, I don't know. Like, I guess it's totally fine if you want to handcraft your clay pots or whatever. That's totally viable. It's great. I even think that person probably has something to gain from thinking about using tools as a lever. Like, well, maybe there's an aspect of this I haven't thought of, or there's a new technique, or maybe I don't know. Like, I'm not a pottery person. So I don't know. But I think that like, I think creativity, I don't think really changes. I think the tools that we have at our disposal are what changes.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the biggest thing I'm taking away from this is like it is a tool, like we created it.
Yeah, it didn't come from outer space.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
It's not an alien species. It's like a nerd created it. Like
Yeah.
like a really smart dude.
Sure.
Who now feels bad that he created it, right? Like now
Yeah.
we're seeing like the guy from Google like resigns and he's like, oh, I think it might do harm. Like, okay, well, you created it though.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I guess you think about all of the, and we've only even touched on creativity, but the like impacts it'll have on medicine and the impacts it'll have on, all of the sciences, and like those things will be incredible. So yeah, there is a lot of good to come of it as well, and there's also parts that I'm feeling like are inevitable. Like you think about like the printing press and you think about the internet, like those two inventions, like they did change the way people worked and like got rid of jobs and like
Absolutely.
But then society changes around it and works with what it has, and it's not like people are necessarily being left behind. Like yeah, so there's kind of that aspect of it. Well, there will be inevitable parts. I think there's a little bit that's scary too.
Yeah.
And there's stuff that we have yet to learn about it. But it is exciting. It's exciting to see like the trajectory it's taken recently. Us working in a creative field, we're still trying to figure out like how to use it. We have one of our owners, Will, is like really big on AI. He was just showing me some stuff with Bard, and I was like, put this in. And he was like, and then it like spit out like a bunch of stuff. I was like, that's cool. Like we could start using it for different things. But yeah, we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll have you back in like a year, and it could be a completely different landscape. Like, I don't know, AI could be our overlord by then.
Could be.
Who knows?
Yeah, we'll all be like wearing AI overlord hats and
like
uniforms
AI.
and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. The only thing I want to touch on real quick
Yeah.
is as we wrap up is I think there will be impacts to society that are negative. Like this is not, there's no panacea here, but handwriting books went out of style with the printing press.
Sure.
And, I can name a bunch of different, tools and platforms that were created that change things for the worse in the short term for some people. But I don't think that I think it's all too convenient to sort of wash that away and say, oh, just get trained. Like it's not that easy. And I think that it's our responsibility as a society to take care of those types of people who struggle or are in jobs that are, significantly detrimentally impacted because AI, for example, like you don't need, I'm making it up, like whatever task AI can be automated to do. Okay, those people no longer have jobs. Well, it's not that they don't have jobs. It's that maybe they didn't get trained in a certain way. So I know that one of the things that we're working on right now is kind of a guiding principles document in our company around, okay, well, how do we think about AI? And we've created a set of use cases. I don't know if you saw the Amazon thing. They published a set of use cases. We've published our own set of use cases internally, like what are the kinds of things we should be thinking about doing and who is doing them? Because we can't afford as a business to get run over by the competition who now is speeding ahead doing different things, good or bad, by the way. So there's a real investment here, in terms of like, well, what are these tools? Because they are powerful and they're here. Like they're just here. They're not going to go away. So closing our eyes and, hoping the government is going to like shut it down somehow, it's not going to stop it. So I think there are some negatives. And I think the last thing I'll say is like, it kind of feels like that movie Don't Look Up. Like, I don't know if you saw that movie. Like it kind of feels like that. Maybe not quite as dramatic, but like AI can do some amazing things, and we're like in the first, like there's no outs in the top of the first inning with this thing. And by the way, research has been going on for 50 years.
Yeah.
And we're still at the very, very beginning of it. So the kinds of things that we'll be able to do in the near future are going to be incredible. And so I think it's just important, especially as creators, like keep your eyes open. Like what's going on? Like what's actually happening here? How do I take advantage of these capabilities? Because they're going to feel magical, and then they're going to not. They're going to be like, well, now they're everywhere because they're not very expensive to get your hands on. So I think it's going to be a wild ride. A year. I'm happy to come back in a year, but I think in 6 months you're going to be like, what the heck? Yeah,
exactly. We'll have to do like a quarterly or periodic like mark check-in of like this state of the
No one wants to hear me
AI.
talk that much.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I know this is not the end of this conversation for us, but I feel like I've come away with at least a better understanding of how this impacts creativity. And hopefully those that are listening have kind of started the process of exploring what this means for their field. And just wanted to say thank you for your time, and thank you for joining us today.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome.